clerk will read the order of the day.
Thanks,
guys. Private members' business, items inside the order of precedence. Item number 6, standing in the name of Dr. Kaye.
President.
Dr. John Kaye.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I move that leave be given to bring in a bill for an act to require the New South Wales Government to increase renewable energy generation and expand energy efficiency measures in New South Wales to allow for the replacement and closure of the state's coal and fossil gas-fired power stations by 2030 and create new employment opportunities in the electricity industry and for other purposes, transforming New South Wales' energy sector towards 100% renewables bill.
The question is that leave be given to bring in a bill. All those of that opinion say aye.
Aye.
Contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Mr. President, I present the bill and move that the bill be read for a first time and printed.
The question is that the bill be read a first time and printed. All those of that opinion say aye. To the contrary, no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it.
Mr. President, I move that the bill be read for a second time. Mr. President...
Order.
I'm sorry.
Transforming New South Wales energy sector towards 100% renewables bill 2014, first reading.
The Honourable John Kaye.
Mr. President, I move that the bill be read for a second time. Mr. President, it's time that we had the conversation. It's time that we confronted the consequences of an energy economy dominated by coal and gas. And it's time for a vision that goes beyond the pollution-intensive business-as-usual model and reaches out to a jobs-rich, sustainable future based on 100% renewables. It's time that that conversation has to begin with the realities of the fossil fuel that dominate the electricity generation in New South Wales and indeed in the entire national electricity market. It is time that we faced up to the 60 million tonnes of carbon dioxide that the gas and coal-fired power stations in New South Wales emit each year. It is time that we recognise that on quite conservative estimates, that 60 million tonnes of carbon dioxide is inflicting $12 billion worth of damage globally onto health, onto infrastructure, onto food production, onto coastal populations and onto other human costs. That conversation, Mr. President, has to go beyond, has to recognise the $800 million of coal-fired power station-related health costs in New South Wales. It has to recognise the governance integrity impacts of coal mining and gas extraction industries. It has to recognise the local social and environmental damages inflicted on local communities across New South Wales by coal mines and coal seam gas wells, and the growing community outrage which is on clear public view in places like Bentley and Laird State Forest. Mr. President, that conversation has to focus on jobs and the economy as much as it does on the environmental imperatives. It needs to recognise that coal and gas are dead-end technologies. It needs to recognise that while that coal and gas are dead-end technologies that will see declining levels of employment, while with the appropriate intelligent policy settings, wind, solar, sustainable biomass and energy efficiency will generate thousands, tens of thousands of new jobs and new investment in our economy, in research, in development, in design, manufacture, marketing, installation, operations, maintenance and management. And it will do so in numbers that will far outstrip employment in the coal industry, the coal seam gas industry and the coal-fired electricity industry. That conversation must go beyond just seeing renewable energy as a boutique source of power. But it must see renewable energy as a source that is at the heart of the future of New South Wales. And I note, Mr. President, that this morning the New South Wales Government released their response to the expert panel's call for submissions into the Federal Government's review of the renewable energy target. And I welcome the opening statement of that review, which says, quote, "The New South Wales is committed to secure, affordable and renewable energy future for New South Wales. For the first time, the New South Wales Government has acknowledged that the future of New South Wales is based on renewable energy. And I congratulate, and I take the interjection of the government's whip, in the New South Wales office.
I'm no lucky of the executive. I've got my own line, thank you very much.
I call the Honourable Peter Phelps to order for the first time.
Thank you, Mr President. Mr President, I note that it's not just the Greens and the community that's calling for a renewable energy future. It is now the Baird government that is saying so, and I welcome their commitment. While the document itself is flawed in some aspects, it is a huge step forward compared to the Baird government's attempts to stymie the development of wind. Mr President, this conversation, if it is to be honest, must be based on the facts that lead us to the inevitable conclusion that this state has to have 100% renewable electricity generation, and that objective is possible, it is affordable and it is essential. This bill will bring that conversation into this Parliament by laying out a policy and governance roadmap to achieve 100% renewables by 2030. It is part, however, Mr President, of a much bigger conversation that is engaging the community, experts, the renewable energy industry, the public sector and the workforces throughout New South Wales. Mr President, this bill proposes to reach its goal of 100% renewables by 2030 by, one, creating an expert panel to develop a plan for the best mix of renewable technologies and energy efficiency by 2030. Secondly, by requiring the expansion of renewable technologies to start closing down coal-fired power stations by 2017. Thirdly, by banning the development of new coal-fired power stations and new fossil gas-fired power stations over a certain size. Fourthly, Mr President, this bill will require the government to table a timetable to close down all coal-fired and gas-fired power stations by 2030. It develops employment guarantees for all employees, and it creates a sustainable and fair feed-in tariff for rooftop solar and other distributed energy sources, and repeals the draft planning guidelines that are holding the wind industry to ransom, and encourages the growth of those industries. Our approach uses regulation to drive public and private sector investment in the renewable energy industry, based on a clear timetable to exit from fossil fuels. It is based on the objective of building a robust and resilient economy for New South Wales in the new clean technologies. Mr President, there's no doubt that there are members of this chamber who will get up and say that this goal is impossible. They are wrong. Professor Mark Diesendorf from the University of New South Wales, in refereed publications in the journal Energy Policy, has published his studies based on hour-by-hour simulation over 2 years of historic data of wind and sunshine and energy demand records, using a hypothetical mix of currently available off-the-shelf renewable energy technologies. He showed that the lights would stay on without gas and without burning coal. He showed that industry would continue to operate. He showed that indeed 100% renewable energy technology is available right now. Mr President, based on wind power, based on rooftop solar and concentrated solar thermal, based on burning sustainable crop wastes, the University of New South Wales has shown that the economy continues to operate without gas and without coal. The University of Melbourne study, commissioned by Beyond Zero Emissions, reached a similar conclusion. Mr President, there may be people present who would dispute what happens at the University of New South Wales and the University of Sydney. However, they will have a much harder time disputing the April 2013 report of the Australian Energy Market Operator, which looked at load projections for 2030 and 2050 and found that with a mix of sustainable energy technologies, it was possible to meet their reliability standards of the electricity generation remaining available 99.998% at the time. Mr President, these are hard-nosed engineers whose sole objective is maintaining the reliability of the electricity industry. These are hard-nosed engineers who came to the conclusion that it is entirely possible to create a 100% renewable future for the electricity networks of the national electricity grid, including New South Wales. All three of these studies show that the diverse location of renewable energy sources will smooth out the impacts of variabilities in sunshine and wind, especially in the presence of concentrated solar thermal with storage and the combustion of sustainable crop waste. Mr. President, all these studies were based on existing technologies. There is no question that massive technology development will make the task easier as it progresses. In the time that I have been drafting this bill and working on bringing this bill into this Parliament, the cost of rooftop solar power stations has fallen by about 15%. A conservative estimate is it will continue to fall in real terms by 5% off into the future every year. Mr. President, the next complaint that we've brought against this bill will be that some members will say it's simply unaffordable. It is time to dispel the myth that renewable energy is expensive. Mr. President, in a study released on the 7th of February 2013, Bloomberg New Energy Finance came to the conclusion that, quote, electricity can be supplied from a new wind farm at a cost of $80 a megawatt hour compared to $143 a megawatt hour for a new coal-fired plant or $116 for a new baseload power plant, including the cost of emission under the Gillard government's carbon pricing scheme. They went on to say, however, even without a carbon price, wind energy is 14% cheaper than new coal and 18% cheaper than new gas. Mr. Michael Librich, the Chief Executive of Bloomberg New Energy Finance, observed, quote, the perception that fossil fuels are cheap and renewables are expensive is now out of date. Mr. President, I'll say that again. The perception that fossil fuels are cheap and renewables are expensive is now out of date. Not only is it now out of date, but it will be increasingly out of date as time goes on. Bloomberg's New Energy Finance's research in Australia shows that since 2011, the cost of wind generation has fallen by 10%, and the cost of solar photovoltaics by 29%. In contrast, the report goes on to say the cost of energy from new fossil fuel plants is high and rising. End of quote. Mr. President, Bloomberg has come to the definite conclusion that renewable energy is currently cheaper and is going to get a whole lot cheaper. Mr. President, UBS, the merchant banking company, released data this month which showed that by 2018, based on a 5% annual capital cost reduction in rooftop solar, off-grid rooftop solar will be cost compatible for the average household, and beyond 2018 it will be cheaper. And it's likely to get cheaper at an accelerating rate. The 5% assumption made by UBS is actually quite conservative. Mr. President, it is clear, it is absolutely clear that the day of cheap fossil fuels is over and the day of expensive renewable energy has long since passed us. Cost estimates based on Beyond Zero emissions work is that our plan would cost about $10 billion a year over 15 years. That's based on current technology costs, but it would probably be a lot less as it probably cost a lot less as some of the technologies continue to become cheaper. Mr. President, some will say $10 billion a year of capital investment is a lot. However, when you compare it to the cost of doing nothing, it is relatively small. At $200 a tonne, which is a conservative estimate of what each tonne of carbon dioxide costs the planet when it's released, the cost of operating the New South Wales electricity industry is about $12 billion a year. That is, every year, the damage inflicted by the carbon dioxide that comes from the New South Wales electricity industry inflicts $12 billion of damage onto the future of food production, on the future of agriculture, onto the future of infrastructure, onto the future impacted by droughts, by sea level rise. When you add into that the public health costs of coal-fired power stations and the subsidies in the cheap fuel, the subsidies that go to coal-fired power stations and the coal mines that support them, the annual cost of business as usual, the do-nothing cost, is probably about $14 billion a year or much more. It begins to make the cost of making transitions look highly affordable. But the real question that people will want to ask is what will be the impact of power bills by 2030 under the scheme outlined by this bill? Well, it's straightforward. If the state does, the real question is if the state does nothing, if we stay on the same path of increasing domination of coal and gas, what will happen to power bills compared to transformation to 100% renewables? Well, both Bloomberg and UBS suggest that the falling costs of clean technology are going to result in lower power bills by 2030 than if we do nothing. Further, any attempt to internalise the real costs of fossil fuel combustion, to bring into power bills any reflection of the real costs imposed by releasing 60 million tonnes of carbon dioxide each year, will make wind and solar far cheaper than fossil fuels. Further, Mr President, the benefits of distributed generation will put more downward pressure on power bills. Avoiding the costs of building new power lines, new transformers, new distribution and transmission infrastructure is one of the most effective ways of reducing power bills. Despite the propaganda coming from the former O'Farrell government and indeed, sadly, still from the Baird government, it is not the carbon price that has resulted in the 50% increase in power bills over the last 6 years. It is overwhelmingly ridiculous decisions about supply reliability that were made by the former Labor government and the then Energy Minister Frank Sartor that drove up investment in wires and poles to an extent that has punished consumers and households across the state. Some in this chamber, Mr President, will say that such a transformation is not essential. I will leave aside the moral imperative of contributing to the global effort to live sustainably. That ought to be sufficient, but clearly for some it will not be sufficient. But for those people, I say there is an economic imperative to make the transition. Jobs in the fossil fuel industry are doomed. It's not just because of the automation of the mines and power stations and the increasing replacement of individuals in those, of workers in those industries by automation and by robots, but it is more about what is going to happen globally as the consensus builds that the planet is in trouble and pressure comes on New South Wales's coal industry. New South Wales really has two choices. We can go ahead with business as usual and we can face the certainty of the day when the world turns to Australia and says, not only do we no longer want your fossil fuels, but you cannot continue to emit 50 tonnes per person per year in greenhouse gases. As the rest of the world makes the transition to renewable energy, Australia risks being left behind and becoming a global pariah that will increasingly attract international attention and increasingly attract international pressure to make a transition to our own carbon-intensive industries. Mr President, business as usual is the carbon dead end. It has to be avoided because it is extremely expensive. When we reach that carbon dead end, we will not have control over the timetable. We will not have control over the jobs. We will not have control over the technologies. We will be forced into rushed and panicked decisions to make the transition that the rest of the world will have made ahead of us. We will be importing the technologies. We will be losing the opportunities for those jobs. The alternative is that we make our own determination on a timetable. If we do that, we can generate the jobs, 73,800 direct and indirect jobs by an estimate from the University of Newcastle, and possibly more if we become world leaders and get involved in the business of export of technology and services. But we can only do this if we make our own choices. We can only do this if we drive a timetable that puts us ahead of the rest of the world, not behind the rest of the world. New South Wales needs to be a world leader in renewable energy. New South Wales needs to be a world leader in sustainable renewable energy. New South Wales needs to get the jobs. New South Wales needs to get the leadership that will enable us to get the jobs. What this bill lays out, Mr President, is a plan that is possible, and that possibility derives from studies by the Australian Energy Market Operator that is affordable, that will lower the costs and lower household power bills, and it is essential if New South Wales is to avoid the carbon dead end that will hollow out jobs and destroy our economy. Mr President, I turn now to some of the detailed provisions in the bill and explain how we will do that. Part A of the bill requires the generation of 500 megawatts of electricity from renewable sources and energy efficiency by 2017. It does so by requiring the New South Wales Government to immediately begin planning for the replacement of a 500 megawatt generator by January 2017. To this end, the Minister for Energy and Resources will be required to appoint an expert panel to consider and make recommendations on the portfolio of energy efficiency and renewable energy measures that will be required to meet this target. The panel consists of a number of people, including 5 independent experts, 1 individual with expertise in finance, representatives of the Unions New South Wales, the New South Wales Council of Social Services, the Nature Conservation Council, the wind industry, the solar industry, the energy efficiency industry. Mr President, that panel is to take into account a number of criteria that include the need to provide protections for low and middle income households from rising electricity bills, opportunities for the Government of New South Wales to support and facilitate community-owned and community-operated renewable energy generation projects, the need to remove barriers that prevent private investment in renewable energy technologies, and the environmental, social and economic benefits of direct public investment and ownership of renewable energy projects. Mr President, Part C of the bill creates a timetable for the closure of all existing coal-fired power stations by 2030. Acting on the advice of an expert panel, the Minister for Energy and Resources will be required to draft and table in both Houses of Parliament a timetable for the closure of all existing fossil fuel power stations by the 1st of January 2030. The timetable will be binding but can be altered by a resolution of both Houses of Parliament. The timetable is to include job guarantees for all displaced power station workers, with a position on equivalent pay scales, with equivalent levels of job securities, and with all benefits, including long service leave and superannuation, to be preserved. Part D of the bill imposes bans on new fossil fuel power stations. Part E of the bill fixes up problems that have occurred in the distributed generation of electricity, including providing for a feed-in tariff for all distributed renewable energy sources at a price set by the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal, which approximates the relevant retail purchase price. No longer will households get almost nothing for their rooftop solar. Instead, they will be paid a reasonable price, which represents the profits that are made from that electricity by the electricity retailers. Part F of the legislation fixes up the wind power problems that have been created by the former O'Farrell government's draft New South Wales planning guidelines for wind farms. Those guidelines are to be replaced with guidelines that are rational and based on science. It includes sensible buffer distances and noises that reflect the South Australian standards. It makes no sense, Mr President, to drive away 28 wind projects from New South Wales that offer the state the possibility of $7.2 billion of investment, 4,000 jobs, and reducing 16.8 million tonnes of carbon dioxide from our annual output. Mr President, that would be a 28% reduction in the state's greenhouse gas emissions from its electricity industry. I look forward to the debate around the future of the wind industry, a critical initial and long-term player in the transition to 100% renewables that deserves to be treated better than it is by the Abbott government with their attack on the renewable energy target and by the Baird government by the draft wind planning guidelines. The attack on wind needs to come to an end. It needs to be recognised as a responsible and important citizen, a critical citizen in the future of the state. Part F of our legislation begins that process. Part G of our legislation would remove New South Wales government subsidies to coal and fossil gas operations for the purposes of electricity generation and redirect those subsidies into the renewable energy industry. Mr President, this bill will no doubt stimulate heated debate in this chamber, and I look forward to that debate. There will those that will be worried about the stranded assets problem. What will happen to the existing fossil fuel generators in a 100% renewable future? To them, we say this: That problem is inevitable. This state will be 100% renewable one way or another. Sooner or later, those fossil fuel power stations will become the dinosaurs that they deserve to be right now. They will become stranded assets. To them we say, this process has been happening for some time. To them we say, at the time of power privatisation, the Greens warned that these assets were impaired not just by a carbon price, but by an imperative for this state to shut down its fossil fuel generators. Those who purchased those power stations cannot say that they were not warned. I made public statements, my colleagues made public statements, I made statements in this chamber that privatisation would undermine the capacity to cheaply close down those power stations. That time has come now, Mr President. Those warnings are coming true now. We did so publicly, and we did so in a way that nobody can say they were not warned. There are those who will be worried about jobs in the electricity industry. Yes, there are about 5,800 jobs in the fossil fuel-fired electricity industry by our estimates, about 1,800 in the coal-fired power stations, about 4,000 in that portion of the state's coal mines that provide coal to those coal-fired power stations. But those 5,800 jobs are a relatively small number compared to the massive number of jobs that will be generated in the fossil fuel industry. And our bill contains at its heart an employment guarantee promise to every single individual in the coal-fired electricity industry. No job will be lost. A legislated promise that every single job will be compensated and will be available for people in the renewable energy sector. This is not a jobs killing bill. This is a jobs creating bill. This is a bill that will create a future for New South Wales that is jobs rich. Those who currently work in coal-fired power stations and in the coal mines that support them deserve the first right to be moved into those new jobs, and we will secure those jobs for those individuals. Exciting jobs, worthwhile jobs, unionised jobs, jobs that create, that they know that they are creating a robust and secure economic future. There are those who will say that who will say they are concerned about the impact on power bills. To them we say there is good advice, there is strong reasons to believe that with energy efficiency and with renewable energy, in fact, we can bring down power bills. And indeed, based on the evidence of Bloomberg, based on the evidence that comes out from the University of New South Wales, if we want lower power bills in 2030, the worst thing we could do is sit back and allow business as usual. What is needed in New South Wales is a plan for transition that not just generates jobs but brings down household power bills. Yes, the price of electricity might go up, but, Mr President, households don't pay the price, they pay the product of price and quantity. And the trick here, Mr President, is to bring down quantity with energy efficiency, to stop the waste of energy, to help households avoid squandering energy, to make sure that they have the opportunity to be participants in the renewable energy revolution that will come to this state sooner or later. And there are those, Mr President, who reject the climate science and who say we don't have to do this because there is some kind of conspiracy that says that the billions of tonnes of carbon dioxide that are emitted into the atmosphere each year are not affecting the climate and do not need to be worried about. Mr President, to them we say, well, that is your right to believe that. We don't agree with you. That is your right to believe that. However, everything we do in this bill, every single measure in this bill, will leave New South Wales stronger. It will leave New South Wales wealthier. It will leave New South Wales with more jobs. It will leave New South Wales with an economy that is more robust, that is more resilient, that is less dependent on commodities and more dependent on the skills that this state has in its workforce. Everything in this legislation says that we build a stronger New South Wales by making that transition. Even if for some bizarre reason members of this chamber do not accept the consensus science, the overwhelming consensus science that says that we have to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, they should support this legislation because this legislation, even without climate impacts, is in the best interests of this state. Yes, it will annoy the fossil fuel industry. Yes, it will get those who are holding impaired and stranded assets offside. Yes, it will cause some people to be uncomfortable. And yes, it lays out a difficult path for New South Wales, a challenging path, a path that requires a skilled workforce, a path that requires us to protect our TAFE system to make sure that we have that skilled workforce to make that transition in 15 years. But, Mr President, at the end of that process, we are not just stronger because of our economy, we are stronger because we work together to achieve an outcome that is in our good and is in the good of the planet. Mr President, this is the conversation that we have to have. This is the conversation that we have to have if we are to build a state that confronts the challenges of the 21st century in a way that leaves us proud of what we have done in this chamber and proud of what we have done as a state. Mr President, I commend the legislation to the House.